The Mindbender Academy spent 200 years perfecting fear as an art form. Their graduates could break crystalline Nethys and terrify Windari into submission. But today, 3 elite students face their final exam. A human prisoner who walks in like he's attending a conference, not an interrogation. And he's about to turn their entire system inside out. The main hall of the Mindbender Academy displayed rows of gently humming crystalline shards, each one a perfect prism reflecting light in unsettling patterns. These weren't gemstones or mineral samples. They were recorded minds. Each specimen represented a distinct species whose psychological breaking point had been meticulously documented and preserved. A Velcroyan consciousness fractured through precisely calibrated tactile overload. A Nethys intelligence shattered by harmonic frequencies it couldn't process. The Academy called them teaching aids. Everyone else called them trophies. You'd find them arranged chronologically along the Hall of Mastery, from the early crude attempts to the recent elegant demolitions. The progression showed 2 centuries of refinement in the art of psychological demolition. They'd turned fear into a measurable, predictable force they could manipulate like temperature or pressure. Their methods assumed terror operated on universal principles across all sentient life. They'd mapped the exact biochemical triggers for Gorthan panic response. They'd quantified the precise psychic frequency that unraveled telepathic species. Their graduates didn't just understand fear, they could manufacture it on demand. These living weapons then deployed across Confederation space as interrogators, negotiators, and occasionally as very specific forms of pest control. The most successful alumni had their techniques added to the curriculum, their breakthroughs becoming required study for new students. The entire system operated on one core belief. Every mind has a breaking point, and finding it was simply a matter of applying the right pressure with sufficient precision. They'd never encountered a consciousness they couldn't eventually unravel. Their confidence wasn't arrogance. It was mathematically verified through hundreds of documented successes. The trophy wall proved their methods worked on every species from methane breathers to energy-based life forms. What they hadn't accounted for was humanity's peculiar relationship with fear. Our species didn't just experience terror. We'd built entire cultures around studying it, commercializing it, and in some cases even enjoying it. The Academy's carefully calibrated systems were about to meet a psychological profile that treated fear as something to analyze rather than something to flee from. Their universal constants were about to become variables, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. BXR, Nixwin, and Guthmos stood at the Academy's pinnacle, 3 perfect products of the system. They'd each chosen distinct specializations within psychological manipulation, becoming living embodiments of their chosen disciplines. Their instructors called them the triumvirate of terror, though they preferred thinking of themselves as artists working in the medium of fear. BXR came from the Nax species, her nasal receptors capable of detecting fear pheromones at concentrations, measuring parts per quadrillion. She could identify the exact biochemical signature of terror in any oxygen-breathing species, then synthesize counter-compounds that amplified those responses. Her technique involved creating custom chemical cocktails that triggered instinctive panic responses buried deep in evolutionary memory. She'd once reduced a battle-hardened Gorthan warlord to a fetal position by mimicking the scent of his species' primordial predator. Nixwin operated on an entirely different spectrum. Her telepathic abilities allowed her to slip past mental defenses like smoke under a door. She didn't broadcast thought so much as weave psychic suggestions into the target's own mental processes. Her specialty was the telepathic chorus, layering multiple subtle influences that the victim would mistake for their own intrusive thoughts. She'd convinced a paranoid schizophrenic Veltrani that his imaginary voices were actually real and extremely disappointed in his life choices. Guthmos represented the most direct approach. As a void devourer, he literally metabolized emotional energy. Fear provided his most nutritious meal, and terrified subjects fueled both his physical strength and psychic abilities. His technique involved gradually increasing psychological pressure until the subject's terror reached a peak sustainable output. He'd once maintained a Quarian merchant in a state of perfect terror for 17 standard hours, emerging from the session visibly larger and glowing with absorbed energy. Their training progression read like a catalog of psychological resilience. They'd started with simple species that broke easily, The jumpy Tellurians who startled at sudden noises, the anxiety-prone Florians who worried about everything. Then came intermediate challenges like the stoic Draconians who required sustained pressure, and the logical Vulpin who needed their rationality systematically dismantled. Their final practice subjects included the notoriously resistant species, methane breathers with alien psychologies, crystalline entities with distributed consciousness, even energy beings whose fear responses defied conventional measurement. They approached their human examination with the calm confidence of master chefs preparing a familiar recipe. The Academy's briefing mentioned some anomalous data about human psychology, but they dismissed it as the result of previous interrogators using inadequate techniques. They'd encountered similar reports about other species that later proved perfectly breakable with proper methodology. What they didn't realize was that their entire approach contained a fundamental flaw. They treated fear as a simple stimulus response mechanism, assuming that increasing the stimulus would inevitably produce the desired terrified response. They'd never considered that a species might develop psychological frameworks that treated fear as data, rather than experience. Their methods were designed for minds that reacted to terror. They had no protocols for minds that analyzed it. Meanwhile, in a holding chamber 3 levels below, their examination subject was being processed through standard intake procedures. Security scans noted his calm vital signs, his lack of defensive posturing, his curious observation of the facilities. The guards assumed he was in shock or denial about his situation. They'd encountered many prisoners who put on brave faces initially. They all broke eventually. Commandant Thexanol stood before the 3 students in the briefing chamber, his 4 hands clasped behind his back in the Academy's traditional posture of academic authority. The holographic display behind him showed the rotating emblem of the Mindbender Academy, its intricate patterns representing the many psychological principles they claimed to have mastered. His announcement carried that particular blend of pride and warning that senior instructors perfect after decades of teaching. The final examination would involve a human prisoner, captured near the volatile border of Confederation space. Not some minor territorial dispute or simple customs violation either. This individual had been detained under circumstances the briefing deliberately left vague. The implication hung in the air like suspended animation. This subject represented something the Confederation didn't fully understand and couldn't comfortably categorize. Previous encounters with humanity had produced psychological profiles that read like contradictory medical case studies. Their fear responses didn't follow established patterns across any known species spectrum. Standard interrogation protocols either failed completely or produced such bizarre results that analysts questioned their equipment calibration. Some humans exposed to fear induction techniques showed amusement responses. Others displayed analytical curiosity about the methods being used. A few even asked technical questions about the equipment, while apparently experiencing what should have been debilitating terror. The data showed physiological stress markers without corresponding psychological distress. Their bodies reacted while their minds remained curiously detached. Standard sensory overload techniques that reduced most species to pleading wrecks sometimes made humans more focused and alert. Isolation protocols meant to induce psychological breakdown occasionally resulted in creative problem-solving or meditation. Even direct neural stimulation designed to trigger primal terror responses often produced what human observers later described as interesting sensory experiences. The triumvirate of terror exchanged glances that conveyed mutual understanding. They'd seen this pattern before with other species where previous interrogators had used clumsy techniques. Incompetent application of psychological principles could indeed produce anomalous results. They'd all broken subjects that previous teams had declared unbreakable simply by applying their more refined methodologies. BXR mentally reviewed the human biochemical profile, already planning custom compound formulations. Nixwin considered the neural architecture schematics, mapping potential telepathic entry points. Guthmos calculated the probable emotional energy output, estimating the nutritional value of human terror. They saw a challenging but solvable puzzle, not a fundamental problem with their entire approach. This confidence represented their first critical miscalculation, though they wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. They assumed human psychology operated on the same basic principles as every other species, just with different calibration settings. The concept that an intelligent species might develop an entirely different relationship with fear never occurred to them. They treated the briefing's warnings as commentary on previous interrogators' incompetence rather than evidence of something genuinely unprecedented. The idea that humanity might have institutionalized fear analysis as both profession and pastime lay so far outside their paradigm, they couldn't even conceptualize it. Meanwhile, in the detainment wing, the human subject was undergoing standard pre-interrogation processing. Medical scans noted normal physiological readings despite the stressful circumstances. Psychological monitoring showed curiosity and observation patterns rather than fear or resistance behaviors. The processing drones adjusted their protocols twice, unable to categorize the subject's responses within established parameters. The security team attributed this to translation errors in their monitoring equipment. They'd seen similar anomalies with other species during first encounters. Everything would normalize once the proper interrogation specialists began their work. The system had procedures for unusual subjects, and those procedures always worked eventually. Elsewhere on campus, the examination chamber was being prepared with additional monitoring equipment. The Academy's technical staff assumed they were documenting a breakthrough in human psychological manipulation. They didn't realize they were about to record the demolition of their entire operational philosophy. The door to the examination chamber slid open, with the soft, pneumatic hiss that indicated recent maintenance. Jaime entered not with the cautious shuffle of a prisoner assessing threats, but with the deliberate stride of someone evaluating real estate. His hands remained at his sides, fingers relaxed rather than clenched. His eyes swept across the room with the analytical focus of an engineer inspecting machinery. He paused just inside the threshold, his attention caught by the crystalline projection array suspended from the ceiling. His head tilted slightly as he studied the intricate light patterns. "Fascinating refraction technique," he murmured, more to himself than to his captors. "Are those calibrated for species-specific visual sensitivity or just general disorientation effects?" The three interrogators exchanged glances from their observation positions. BXR's nasal receptors detected no fear pheromones whatsoever, just the mild scent of human perspiration and something that registered as intellectual curiosity. Nixwin's telepathic sweep found no defensive mental barriers because Jaime's mind wasn't putting up any defenses. It was simply observing, cataloging, analyzing. Jaime moved toward the central restraint chair, his expression shifting to professional appraisal. He ran a finger along the armrest, noting the material composition. Smart polymer with embedded neural sensors, I assume? Does it provide real-time biofeedback or just basic restraint functions? He glanced toward the observation window as if addressing technicians at a product demonstration. He examined the sensory emitter arrays with particular interest. Variable frequency and amplitude controls impressive. What's your maximum output range on the ultrasonic spectrum? And do you have haptic feedback integration with the chair? His questions carried the tone of someone discussing technical specifications at a conference, not someone facing psychological torture. His body language remained consistently open and engaged throughout. No crossed arms, no defensive posturing, no signs of elevated stress beyond normal alertness. He moved through the chamber like an architect touring a new building, occasionally nodding at particularly clever design features. The interrogators found themselves in the unfamiliar position of having their methodology treated as technical conversation rather than psychological assault. BXR kept waiting for the biochemical indicators that would guide her compound formulations. Nixwin searched for mental resistance to overcome. Guthmos remained motionless, sensing no emotional energy to consume. Jaime completed his circuit of the room and turned toward the observation window with a slight smile. The aesthetic is quite striking. Minimalistic but functional. The lighting gradients are particularly effective for creating atmospheric tension without being overtly threatening. Very professional setup. The triumvirate of terror found themselves mentally reconfiguring their approach in real time. They'd prepared for resistance, for fear, for defiance, for negotiation, for breakdown. They had protocols for screaming victims and stoic resistors. Their training covered bargaining attempts and psychological warfare tactics. They had absolutely no prepared response for technical questions about their equipment specifications. Their entire operational paradigm assumed the subject would be reacting to their techniques, not evaluating their implementation. The psychological dynamics had reversed within the first 30 seconds, and they were only beginning to recognize the shift Jaime took a seat in the restraint chair without being instructed, his movements relaxed and voluntary. He looked toward the observation window with the expectant expression of someone waiting for a presentation to begin. His entire demeanor suggested he was attending a professional demonstration rather than undergoing interrogation. The interrogators realized they were no longer controlling the situation's emotional framework. Their subject had established a different context entirely, one where fear wasn't the central currency of exchange. They were still operating as psychological combatants while he was functioning as a professional evaluator. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, Jaime maintained, eye contact with the observation window as he adjusted his position in the restraint chair. His voice carried the calm, measured tone of someone explaining basic workplace procedures to new colleagues. I should probably clarify my professional background, he began, as if initiating a conference call rather than responding to interrogation. Back on Earth, I work in criminal behavioral analysis. Specifically, I study predatory psychology and interrogation techniques. He paused, allowing the translation systems to process the terms. My department handles cases involving serial offenders, organized crime structures, psychological manipulation patterns. We analyze how people use fear, coercion, and control against other humans. It's not just theoretical work. We interview convicted manipulators, study their methods, then develop countermeasures. The chamber's monitoring equipment continued recording standard vital signs showing normal stress levels for someone giving a technical presentation. No elevated heart rate, no adrenaline spikes, no biochemical indicators of fear. BXR sensors detected only the mild metabolic activity associated with focused concentration. I've spent 15 years sitting across from people who make their living breaking others. Jaime continued, his hands resting comfortably on the chair's armrests. Ransom negotiators who understand hostage psychology. Cult leaders who manipulate entire communities. Interrogators who specialize in extracting information through psychological pressure. I study their techniques, their patterns, their tells. His explanation carried no boastfulness, just professional matter-of-factness. What you're viewing as an interrogation chamber, I see as a laboratory setup. Those emitters aren't threats. They're data collection devices. The restraint systems aren't for containment. They're control variables. This entire environment represents a fascinating case study in applied psychological theory. Nixwin's telepathic scans encountered something she'd never experienced before. A mind that recognized her intrusion not as violation, but as additional data stream. Jaime's mental response wasn't defensive. It was analytical, noting the quality of the telepathic touch, the subtlety of the approach, the technical precision of the execution. The triumvirate of terror realized they weren't facing a subject to be broken, but a peer reviewer evaluating their methodology. Their techniques weren't being resisted so much as examined, their psychological tools treated as specimens under a microscope. The power dynamic had shifted from interrogator-prisoner to presenter-audience, and they were the ones being evaluated. Jaime's calm demeanor stemmed from professional familiarity rather than naive ignorance. He'd sat across tables from master manipulators who used far cruder but equally effective techniques. He'd analyzed psychological warfare methods that made their crystalline emitters look like beginner-level equipment. His lack of fear came from understanding the mechanisms at work, not from failing to recognize them. The interrogators found themselves in the unsettling position of speaking their specialized language to someone who not only understood it fluently but could critique their accent. Their carefully developed techniques suddenly felt like student presentations before a tenure review committee. The examination wasn't proceeding according to their protocols because the subject had redefined the entire interactions framework. Meanwhile, in the control room, the automated systems continued running the standard examination sequence. The first phase activation protocols engaged precisely on schedule, unaware that the psychological context had fundamentally changed. The emitters began their calibrated sequences. The restraint systems adjusted their monitoring parameters, and the recording apparatus started capturing data according to established procedures. The machinery operated exactly as designed, following programming that assumed traditional interrogator-subject dynamics. The systems couldn't recognize that they were now documenting a professional evaluation rather than a psychological breakdown. Their sensors collected data, while completely missing the significance of what that data represented. BXR initiated the sequence with the smooth confidence of someone executing a perfected technique. The dispersal system released a precisely calibrated mixture of biochemical agents designed to trigger humanity's deepest evolutionary fears. The compounds were engineered to mimic the scent signatures of ancient predators, the chemical markers of imminent danger, the molecular triggers for primal panic responses. Her previous successes with oxygen-breathing species suggested the human would experience rapidly escalating terror within moments. Instead, Jaime took a deliberate breath and tilted his head slightly. "Interesting cocktail," he observed, his voice maintaining the analytical tone of a wine connoisseur assessing a new vintage. "I'm detecting synthesized cortisol analogs, adrenaline precursors, and what feels like synthetic versions of our natural fear pheromones. Very comprehensive approach to biochemical induction." He continued breathing normally while offering technical commentary. "Your compound formulation is impressive, but human metabolisms process these compounds differently than most species. Our livers break down foreign biochemical agents quite efficiently. Also, the dosage seems calibrated for average body mass without accounting for individual metabolic variations." BXR's nasal receptors detected the expected compounds entering Jaime's system, but registered no corresponding fear response. His biochemical profile showed mild interest and focused concentration rather than terror. Her instruments indicated the compounds were being processed and neutralized with unusual efficiency. "The real issue isn't biological, though," Jaime continued, as if lecturing to students. "Humans have centuries of cultural conditioning around chemical fear induction. We've developed entire entertainment industries based on controlled fear experiences. Our amusement parks feature exactly this type of biochemical manipulation in haunted house attractions. People pay credits to experience precisely what you're attempting here." He gestured toward the dispersal vents with a professional nod. "The technical execution is excellent, I should note. The dispersion pattern is even and controlled. The compound stability during aerosolization shows advanced chemical engineering. But the psychological context is all wrong for human subjects." BXR watched her monitors with growing confusion. Her instruments showed the compounds were working exactly as designed at the physiological level: increased heart rate, elevated respiration, hormonal responses. Yet the subject's psychological state remained calm and analytical. The biochemical signals of fear were present without the actual experience of fear. "This would be considered quite sophisticated entertainment back on Earth," Jaime noted. "We have entire subcultures that seek out increasingly intense fear experiences. They'd probably rate this as a 7 out of 10 on the terror scale. Well executed but lacking narrative context." The NAC's interrogator found herself in the unprecedented position of having her biochemical warfare techniques evaluated as entertainment products. Her carefully crafted fear induction was being assessed for its technical merit and consumer appeal, rather than its psychological impact. The compounds worked perfectly, but produced the wrong kind of response. Humanity's resistance to chemical fear induction wasn't a biological adaptation. It was a cultural development. Centuries of horror movies, haunted attractions, fear-based entertainment, and psychological research had created a population that analyzed terror rather than simply experiencing it. They'd turned primal fear into something to be studied, cataloged, and occasionally enjoyed. BXR's confidence began its gradual erosion into professional confusion. She'd never encountered a subject who treated her biochemical expertise as interesting data, rather than overwhelming experience. Her methods assumed a straightforward stimulus-response relationship that simply didn't apply to human psychology. Elsewhere on campus, Nixwen was completing her final telepathic calibration checks. She reviewed the human neural mapping data, adjusting her approach parameters based on the species' unique brain architecture. Her telepathic chorus was preparing to slip past Jaime's mental defenses in the way smoke infiltrates a sealed room. Nixwen activated her telepathic chorus with the deft touch her species had perfected over millennia of mental manipulation. Her consciousness extended toward Jaime's mind not as a battering ram, but as subtle pressure, the psychological equivalent of smoke drifting under a sealed door. She expected to encounter the familiar mental chaos of a terrified subject, the swirling panic, the defensive barriers, the primal fear responses that usually greeted her intrusions. Her telepathic sensors registered immediate contact, but reported anomalous readings. Instead of the expected psychological turbulence, she encountered structured mental architecture organized with almost bureaucratic precision. Jaime's mind wasn't building defensive walls so much as opening filing cabinets. His consciousness recognized her intrusion not as threat but as data stream. Fascinating technique, Jaime's voice commented aloud, though his lips didn't move in the conventional sense. The thought words carried the tone of someone examining an interesting specimen under magnification. The multi-layered approach is particularly elegant. You're not broadcasting thoughts so much as weaving suggestions into existing mental processes. The subject mistakes your influence for their own internal monologue. Nixwin maintained her telepathic pressure while experiencing something entirely unprecedented. Her subject was analyzing her methodology in real time, his mental processes categorizing her techniques with clinical detachment. He noted the precision of her psychic touch, the subtlety of her approach, the technical execution of what should have been an undetectable penetration. Your species' neural mapping appears based on standard telepathic models, Jaime's mental voice continued. Human brains develop different architectural patterns due to our non-telepathic evolution. We compartmentalize analytical and emotional processing more distinctly than species that evolved with psychic abilities. Your techniques are designed for minds that blend these functions. Nixwin increased her telepathic intensity, attempting to bypass the analytical processing and reach the emotional centers. Her sensors showed the thought pattern simply routing her efforts back into the analytical frameworks. Jaime's mind was treating her telepathic assault as information to be processed, rather than as attack to be resisted. The telepath encountered mental discipline of a type her training had never addressed. Humans had apparently developed techniques for separating analytical from emotional responses. Through centuries of psychological research and practical application, they'd turned mental compartmentalization into a cultivated skill rather than a defensive reaction. This would be considered advanced meditation technique back on Earth, Jaime noted mentally. We have disciplines specifically designed to observe mental processes without emotional engagement. Your approach is encountering trained observation rather than primal fear. Nixwin realized her failure stemmed from encountering analysis instead of defense. Her telepathic methods assumed the subject would be fighting the intrusion emotionally. She had no protocols for dealing with someone who welcomed the intrusion as data collection opportunity. The psychological dynamics had reversed without her noticing the shift. Her confidence began its quiet erosion into professional bewilderment. She'd mastered mental manipulation across dozens of species, reading thoughts since before most civilizations developed written language. Yet here she faced a consciousness that treated her ancient art as interesting psychological phenomenon rather than overwhelming experience. The Academy's methods contained a fundamental flaw they'd never detected because they'd never encountered a species that analyzed fear rather than experiencing it. Their techniques were designed for psychological combat against emotional responses. They had no answer for clinical observation, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Guthmos extended his feeding appendages with the practiced motion of a gourmet preparing to sample a fine meal. As a void devourer, he'd consumed the emotional energy of terrified subjects across 17 systems, each species offering its own distinctive flavor profile of fear. His metabolic systems anticipated the rich sustenance of human terror, his receptors tuned to detect the specific frequency of panicked emotional output. The Academy's psychological profiling suggested humans should produce particularly vigorous fear responses. His sensors registered immediate contact with Jaime's emotional field but reported anomalous readings. Instead of the expected surge of terror, they detected only the flatlined output of clinical curiosity. Guthmos experienced the emotional equivalent of reaching for a hearty meal and finding an empty plate. His feeding mechanisms activated but found nothing metabolically useful to process. Jaime's analytical override had effectively neutralized his emotional output. The human mind was treating the experience as data collection, rather than threat response. His psychological processes remained firmly in observation mode, treating Guthmos's feeding attempt as an interesting, biological phenomenon rather than a predatory act. The void devourer experienced something his species rarely encountered: nutritional deficiency from emotional starvation. His metabolic indicators showed insufficient energy intake, his systems reporting the equivalent of attempting to drink from an empty cup. He maintained his feeding pressure while internally recalibrating his approach, unable to comprehend why his techniques weren't producing the expected results. Jaime observed the physiological changes in Guthmos with professional interest. "Fascinating metabolic process," he commented. "You're attempting to feed on emotional energy, correct? The frequency modulation suggests you're particularly tuned to despair frequencies. Interesting evolutionary adaptation for a predator species." He continued his analysis while Guthmos struggled with the unprecedented situation. "Your approach seems designed for species that experience fear as overwhelming emotion rather than analytical data. Human neural patterns don't produce the clean emotional resonance you're seeking when we're in observational mode." Guthmos found himself in the unsettling position of being studied while attempting to consume. His predatory approach had been reversed into a specimen examination. The emotional dynamics had shifted from hunter-prey to researcher-subject without his conscious participation. Jaime's questions carried the tone of scientific inquiry rather than fearful reaction. "Does your species require specific emotional frequencies for optimal metabolic function? And what's the conversion efficiency from emotional energy to physical sustenance?" The Academy's records suggest void devourers can sustain themselves for extended periods on terror-based nutrition. The predator became the observed. The consumer became the specimen. Guthmos's confidence eroded into professional confusion, as he realized his entire feeding methodology was based on assumptions that didn't apply to human psychology. He'd never encountered a subject who treated his predatory nature as interesting biological data rather than existential threat. The Academy's methods contained a fundamental flaw they'd never detected because they'd never tested them against a species that could voluntarily suppress emotional responses through analytical override. Their techniques assumed fear was an involuntary reaction rather than a manageable psychological state. Meanwhile, in the chamber's control systems, hidden subsystems activated according to their programmed sequence. Jaime's neural implant established quantum entanglement with receivers across Confederation space, his biological monitoring systems converting the examination into broadcast data. The session's true purpose began emerging from its concealed operational parameters. Jaime looked from one failed interrogator to another, his expression carrying that particular blend of professional courtesy and academic insight that characterized human experts confronting flawed methodologies. "Your approach contains a fundamental category error," he began, his tone suggesting a colleague pointing out a basic calculation mistake. "You've treated fear as a universal constant when it's actually a cultural variable. Humanity's entire relationship with terror developed along different evolutionary pathways than your models account for." He leaned forward slightly in the restraint chair, the movement fluid and unforced. "Consider how our species systematized fear for social purposes. Religion transformed primal terror into meaning-making machinery. We built entire cosmologies around understanding what frightens us. Entertainment industries refined fear into pleasurable experiences. People pay credits to experience controlled horror in safe environments. Political systems weaponized fear for control but simultaneously created generations, trained to recognize and resist manipulation." The three interrogators maintained their professional composure while internally processing this paradigm shift. Their training had covered psychological principles across hundreds of species, but always within the framework of fear as instinctive response. The concept of fear as cultivated cultural phenomenon lay outside their operational parameters. Human minds learn to analyze fear rather than simply react to it. Jaime continued, "We developed disciplines for studying terror responses, techniques for managing anxiety, entire professions dedicated to understanding psychological manipulation. Your methods assume you're dealing with primitive responses from advanced beings. In reality, you're applying elementary psychology to a species that spent centuries developing countermeasures." He gestured toward the emitters and biochemical dispensers with a dismissive wave. "These techniques would work on humans from a less developed cultural stage, but modern humanity treats fear as data to be processed rather than experience to be avoided. We don't avoid the things that scare us. We study them, analyze them, figure out how they work, and then we master them." The Academy's approach suddenly appeared tragically naive in this new light. Their sophisticated equipment and refined techniques were designed for psychological children, while they were facing psychological adults. Their weapons were elegantly crafted but aimed at the wrong target entirely. Your breaking points assume individual vulnerability, Jaime noted. But humans often endure remarkable personal suffering when they believe it serves larger purposes or protects others. Our resistance isn't biological, it's philosophical. We see systems designed to break people and we systematically dismantle them. He glanced around the chamber as if seeing the entire Academy's philosophy reflected in its design. Our specialization involves understanding how bullies and tyrants operate, people who enjoy breaking things just because they can. We've dealt with them throughout our history, and we've gotten very good at stopping them. The three interrogators listened with dawning comprehension that their encounter represented something far larger than failed interrogation. They weren't facing individual resistance but institutional countermeasures developed over centuries of human experience with oppression and control systems. The goal isn't victory in the moment, Jaime continued. It's prevention of future harm. Your academy represented exactly what humanity exists to counter. Your graduation would have meant more victims across the galaxy. More species subjected to techniques designed to break minds rather than understand them. His explanation carried no malice, only professional certainty. We find systems like yours. We study them. We figure out how they work. And then we make them stop. This wasn't interrogation. It was public health intervention on a galactic scale. The human approach represented a fundamental philosophical difference in dealing with threats. Where the Academy sought to master fear as a weapon, humanity sought to understand cruelty as a pathology. Their methods weren't designed for combat, but for diagnosis and treatment of harmful systems. Jaime's calm professionalism stemmed from viewing the encounter through this philosophical framework. He wasn't resisting their techniques so much as analyzing their underlying assumptions. The Academy's entire approach represented a case study in predatory psychology. Rather than a personal threat, the interrogators realized they'd been operating as practitioners, while humanity functioned as epidemiologists, studying psychological pathogens. Their celebrated techniques were being treated as specimens of harmful behavior patterns, rather than as legitimate professional methods. The staged capture at the Peace Summit, the neural implant recording, the quantum broadcast, all represented applied human philosophy in action. They didn't just resist systems of control, they exposed and dismantled them through careful study and strategic intervention. This preventive approach explained humanity's peculiar psychological profile. Their ability to analyze fear stemmed from treating it as data about systems rather than personal experience. Their resistance to manipulation came from understanding the mechanisms behind it. The Academy's methods had encountered not just a resistant subject, but an entire philosophical counter-tradition. 2 centuries of perfecting psychological demolition faced a species that had spent millennia studying how to prevent exactly that kind of expertise from causing harm. Jaime's actions represented human philosophy. In its purest form, the application of analytical understanding to prevent suffering. The Academy's graduation would have meant more victims, so humanity ensured the graduation wouldn't happen. Elsewhere on campus, the implications were settling in among faculty and students alike. The institution's entire purpose was being recontextualized from center of excellence to subject of intervention. Their celebrated techniques were becoming cautionary examples rather than professional standards. The institution, designed to create masters of psychological manipulation, found itself receiving a lesson in professional humility. The Mindbender Academy's entire operational framework contained a fundamental flaw they'd never detected because they'd never encountered a species that could reveal it. Their system assumed fear operated as universal constant when it actually functioned as cultural variable. Fear-based control mechanisms only work on subjects who grant fear power over them. Human psychology had systematically removed that granting mechanism through centuries of cultural development. Their analytical approach treated terror as information rather than experience, data rather than domination. By understanding fear's mechanisms, they neutralized its weaponized potential. The Academy's techniques represented beautiful solutions to problems that didn't exist in their anticipated forms. Their biochemical formulations were elegantly crafted, their telepathic methods refined through generations of practice. their emotional consumption techniques metabolically sophisticated, yet they were all useless against a consciousness that treated fear as subject for analysis, rather than overwhelming experience. Their graduates were like artists whose medium had ceased to exist. They'd mastered the art of psychological demolition, only to discover their chosen field was based on incomplete understanding of sentient psychology. Their expertise remained technically perfect but fundamentally misapplied to the reality of advanced consciousness. The galaxy's premier institution for psychological terror transformed into cautionary tale within hours. Their celebrated methods became evidence in diplomatic proceedings rather than examples of professional excellence. Their reputation for mastery became synonymous with ethical failure and operational blindness. This reversal demonstrated where true power actually resides in advanced civilizations. The ability to cause suffering represents primitive dominance, compared to the capacity for understanding complex systems. Breaking things requires only force and technique, while understanding systems demands intelligence and empathy. The Academy had focused on perfecting methods for psychological demolition, while humanity had developed frameworks for psychological comprehension. Their approaches represented different evolutionary paths in dealing with consciousness and conflict. One sought to control through fear, while the other sought to prevent harm through understanding. The structural power dynamics had inverted through simple recontextualization. Techniques that appeared dominant in isolation became vulnerable when exposed to broader ethical and philosophical considerations. Methods that worked in controlled environments failed when subjected to public scrutiny and analysis. Humanity's intervention revealed that the Academy's confidence stemmed from limited testing against species that shared similar psychological frameworks. Their 2 centuries of success reflected narrow experience rather than universal principles. They'd mastered fear manipulation within specific cultural contexts but hadn't accounted for divergent psychological evolution. The encounter demonstrated that technological sophistication often masks ethical immaturity. The Academy's advanced equipment and refined techniques served purposes that were fundamentally primitive in their understanding of consciousness and rights. Their operational excellence existed within philosophical limitations they'd never questioned. True, power in interstellar relations lies not in the ability to break others, but in the capacity to understand complex systems and prevent harm. The Academy's approach represented force, while humanity's represented wisdom. One created fear, while the other created safety through comprehension. The institution, designed to produce masters of psychological domination, became students of its own limitations. Their certainty about fear's universal nature became humility about psychological diversity. Their pride in breaking techniques became recognition of understanding's superior value. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Jaime's posture shifted from analytical observer to strategic planner, his tone maintaining that infuriatingly reasonable quality that made his suggestions sound obvious rather than revolutionary. Consider the educational potential here, he began, gesturing around the examination chamber. This facility represents 2 centuries of psychological research that could be repurposed for understanding rather than breaking. The knowledge doesn't have to be lost, it just needs ethical redirection. His proposal carried the weight of someone who'd clearly thought through the logistics. Humanity could help transition the Academy from fear-based training to conflict resolution education. Your biochemical expertise could treat anxiety disorders instead of causing them. Telepathic techniques could facilitate therapeutic communication rather than manipulation. Emotional energy consumption could be studied for medical applications rather than predatory purposes. The 3 interrogators listened with dawning recognition that their professional world wasn't ending but transforming. Their expertise remained valuable, it just needed philosophical reorientation. Their sophisticated equipment and refined techniques could serve healing rather than harm with proper ethical frameworks. The facilities are perfectly configured for psychological work, Jaime noted. The monitoring systems, the environmental controls, the neural interface technology, all could be repurposed for rehabilitation and research. This could become the galaxy's premier center for understanding sentient psychology rather than exploiting it. He glanced toward the observation windows where faculty members were beginning to gather. Even today's demonstration has significant educational value. The recordings show precisely why fear-based approaches fail against analytical species. They document the ethical boundaries that should have been established centuries ago. This isn't failure. It's the most valuable lesson this institution has ever received. The monetary implications began registering with the Academy's administrators monitoring from the control room. Their equipment represented substantial investment that didn't need to be scrapped, just redirected. Their faculty's expertise remained valuable credentials that could be applied to positive ends. Their facilities could generate revenue through ethical services rather than clandestine operations. Humanity's offer represented evolution rather than defeat. The knowledge wasn't wrong, its application was misguided. The same understanding of psychology that created expert interrogators could produce expert therapists. The same technical mastery that built perfect fear induction systems could develop perfect anxiety treatment protocols. The galaxy's foremost institution of psychological terror could become its leading center for psychological healing. The transition would require philosophical shifts rather than technical overhauls. The equipment would remain the same, only its purpose would change. This approach demonstrated humanity's characteristic pragmatism blended with ethical consideration. They didn't propose destroying the Academy's work but redirecting it toward positive ends. Their intervention sought to preserve valuable knowledge while eliminating harmful applications. The resolution represented knowledge serving life rather than destroying it. Expertise that had caused suffering could now prevent it. Techniques that had broken minds could now heal them. The philosophical shift turned liability into asset without discarding 2 centuries of accumulated understanding. Meanwhile, Confederation security vessels established perimeter control around the campus. Their arrival signaled the beginning of the transition from fear-based operations to ethical oversight. The teams moved with professional efficiency, securing facilities without damaging equipment, preserving the Academy's physical assets while changing its operational parameters. The security operation demonstrated the Confederation's recognition that the situation represented opportunity rather than simply failure. Their approach focused on preservation and redirection rather than punishment and demolition. They understood the value contained within the Academy's systems and expertise. The arrival of official oversight marked the start of the institution's transformation. The Mindbender Academy's next chapter would involve the same psychological mastery, applied to fundamentally different purposes. Their celebrated techniques would become historical examples rather than active practices. Their expertise redirected toward understanding rather than domination. The encounter revealed deeper philosophical failures than technical ones. The Academy's sophisticated methods had been built upon ethical foundations so shaky they collapsed under the slightest scrutiny. They'd spent centuries perfecting psychological demolition without ever asking whether they should, treating sentient beings as materials for their craft rather than individuals with rights and autonomy. Their artistic approach ignored basic ethical considerations that even primitive civilizations recognized. Consent was never part of their operational parameters. Consequences beyond successful breaking weren't factored into their equations. They celebrated the elegance of their techniques while ignoring the suffering they caused, treating psychological destruction as aesthetic achievement rather than ethical violation. The trophy wall in the main hall exemplified this moral blindness. Each crystalline shard represented a shattered consciousness, a broken will, a terminated identity. Yet they displayed these psychological autopsies as artistic triumphs rather than ethical failures. Their pride in demolition reflected profound detachment from the reality of what they were doing to other beings. Humanity's intervention forced confrontation with issues the Academy had systematically avoided. The broadcast compelled examination of practices that had operated in ethical isolation for centuries. Suddenly, their methods weren't just technical questions, but moral ones. Their expertise wasn't just professional skill, but ethical responsibility. The Confederation now faced necessary but painful self-examination across multiple institutions. The Academy's practices reflected broader cultural patterns where technological advancement had outpaced ethical development. Their sophisticated interrogation techniques were ethically primitive, their psychological understanding culturally stunted despite technical refinement. Technological sophistication had masked ethical immaturity throughout their operations. Their ability to manipulate fear molecules with precision existed alongside inability to consider basic consent. Their telepathic mastery operated without corresponding moral framework. Their emotional consumption techniques reflected metabolic sophistication, paired with ethical simplicity. The human perspective highlighted this disconnect with brutal clarity. Jaime's commentary treated their methods not as advanced interrogation but as primitive bullying. His analysis revealed that technical excellence meant nothing without ethical consideration. The Academy's celebrated artistry was just systematized cruelty with better equipment. This moral calculus shift extended beyond the Academy itself. Confederation security protocols, diplomatic procedures, even cultural attitudes required re-evaluation. Practices that had seemed normal within their operational context appeared fundamentally flawed when exposed to external ethical frameworks. Their confidence in their methods had blinded them to their ethical shortcomings. The encounter demonstrated that advanced technology doesn't guarantee advanced ethics. A civilization can master biochemistry while failing to understand basic consent. It can develop telepathic precision while lacking empathy. It can consume emotional energy without considering the source's rights. Technical achievement often progresses faster than moral development. Meanwhile, across the campus, students were confronting their new reality. Their career paths had vanished overnight. Their professional identities required complete reconstruction. They faced the uncomfortable process of reevaluating skills they'd mastered through years of study, determining which aspects represented valuable knowledge and which reflected ethical failure. The educational transition would involve more than curriculum changes. It required fundamental philosophical shifts in how they viewed other species, how they approached psychological work, how they balanced technical capability with ethical responsibility. Their training had emphasized what they could do without considering what they should do. This recalibration represented the most challenging lesson the Academy would ever teach. Technical skills could be learned through practice and repetition. Ethical understanding required uncomfortable self-examination and willingness to acknowledge past failures. The students weren't just learning new methods, they were unlearning old assumptions. The security team securing the facilities represented this shift from technical to ethical priorities. Their presence signaled that operational excellence no longer excused ethical failure. Advanced capabilities required corresponding responsibility. Sophisticated methods demanded heightened ethical scrutiny. The galaxy's psychological landscape was undergoing permanent transformation. Practices that had seemed professionally respectable now appeared morally questionable. Techniques that represented career achievements became evidence in ethical investigations. The entire field required redefinition around different values and priorities. Elsewhere on campus, faculty members were beginning the difficult process of reconciling their expertise with their newly revealed ethical failures. Their knowledge remained valuable, but required philosophical recontextualization. Their skills needed ethical redirection rather than technical improvement. Confederation security personnel in crisp uniforms flanked Jaime as he exited the interrogation chamber, their professional detachment providing stark contrast to the institutional chaos unfolding throughout the facility. His calm departure mirrored his arrival. Measured steps, observational gaze, complete absence of distress markers. While alarm systems flashed and faculty members argued in panicked clusters, he maintained the demeanor of someone concluding a business meeting, rather than escaping a psychological torture chamber. The datapad in his hand contained comprehensive documentation of everything that had transpired. Full-spectrum analysis of the biochemical compounds, electromagnetic signatures of the equipment, detailed psychological profiles based on interrogator responses to unexpected resistance. He carried tactical assessments of security protocols and complete breakdowns of every technique they demonstrated. The information represented the most detailed intelligence ever gathered on the Academy's methods. The interrogators realized their entire institutional philosophy was based on incomplete psychological models. They'd mastered the science of fear without understanding its cultural contexts. Their celebrated techniques were beautiful solutions to problems that didn't exist in their anticipated forms. Elsewhere on campus, the recording devices continued functioning with perfect precision. Crystalline shards captured every word, every biochemical reading, every telemetric data point. The systems designed to document psychological breaking points were instead recording the dismantling of psychological assumptions. Monitoring equipment calibrated for measuring terror. Responses documented analytical commentary about those responses. Jaime's professional demeanor shifted from academic curiosity to operational clarity as he tapped the side of his head with 2 fingers. The gesture carried the casual precision of someone activating a familiar device, rather than the desperation of a prisoner attempting some last resort. A subtle neural interface glowed faintly beneath his skin, its activation unnoticed until this moment. "I should mention the recording systems," he said, his tone maintaining that infuriatingly calm professionalism. "My neural implant has been documenting everything since arrival. Biochemical readings, telepathic signatures, emotional energy patterns, all preserved in high-resolution detail. The quantum entanglement communicator bypassed your security protocols about 37 minutes ago." The 3 interrogators stared as their own monitoring equipment suddenly registered the outgoing data stream they'd somehow missed. Their sophisticated security systems, designed to detect conventional transmissions, had completely failed to recognize the quantum entanglement technology operating on principles. Their scanners couldn't interpret. The broadcast reached 18 Confederation member species. Approximately 6 minutes ago, Jaime continued, watching their comprehension dawn with clinical interest. "Diplomatic observers from each world are monitoring in real time. Your nightmare. Syndicate colleagues seem particularly interested in the techniques you've been demonstrating." The triumvirate of terror experienced the peculiar sensation of their professional world inverting around them. Their examination chamber had become a demonstration theater. Their interrogation techniques had become evidentiary exhibits. Their confident application of psychological principles had become a public performance of institutional failure. Every biochemical compound Bixar had synthesized was now documented with formulation data and intended effects. Every telepathic nuance Nixwin had employed was recorded with neural response patterns. Every feeding attempt Guthmos had made was preserved with metabolic interaction details. The Academy's most guarded secrets were streaming across the Confederation as educational content. The interrogators realized they weren't the examiners, but the examined. Their final assessment wasn't a graduation requirement, but a professional autopsy. Their celebrated techniques were being dissected before an audience of the very species they'd previously manipulated. The psychological dominance they'd cultivated had become diplomatic liability. Humanity hadn't just resisted their methods. They'd turned the entire encounter into intelligence-gathering operation. The capture at the Proxima Nebula Peace Summit had been staged, the apparent vulnerability calculated, the entire scenario engineered to expose systems that operated outside ethical boundaries. They'd walked into a trap while believing they were springing one. The quantum entanglement technology represented a level of sophistication the Academy's security models hadn't accounted for. Their protocols were designed to block conventional transmissions, not instantaneous communication through entangled particles. Humanity's understanding of quantum mechanics had advanced beyond their defensive capabilities. The session's true architecture emerged with brutal clarity. Monitoring equipment they thought served their purposes actually documented their failures. Recording systems they controlled preserved evidence against them. Their own facilities had become the setting for their professional dismantling. The Mindbender's carefully guarded secrets were becoming public knowledge across 18 star systems. Techniques that had taken centuries to refine were being analyzed by species that had been their test subjects. The psychological dominance they'd weaponized was being systematically deconstructed before a galactic audience, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The quantum broadcast reached Confederation diplomatic channels. Precisely as the 3 interrogators were realizing their methodology had fundamental flaws. The transmission didn't just show their failed techniques. It documented every biochemical formulation, every telepathic frequency, every metabolic reading from their attempts to break a human subject. The data stream included comprehensive annotations about each method's intended effects and actual results, turning their professional demonstration into evidentiary documentation. Formal complaints began arriving within minutes of the broadcast's conclusion. 43 member species filed official protests regarding the Academy's use of their citizens as practice subjects without consent. The diplomatic messages shared a common theme of outrage that sentient beings had been treated as laboratory materials rather than individuals with rights. The complaints cited specific incidents where Academy graduates had used these techniques on diplomatic personnel, turning what the institution considered training exercises into documented violations of interstellar law. The Nightmare Syndicate's response stood out for its particular fury. Their communication arrived encrypted in threat-grade syntax, expressing extreme displeasure at the non-consensual use of their citizens for psychological experimentation. The Syndicate's reputation for ruthless retaliation made their formal complaint particularly concerning to Confederation officials. Their message implied consequences that extended beyond diplomatic channels, suggesting the Academy's actions might be addressed through less formal means. The Galactic Council issued an emergency suspension of the Academy's operating license within hours of the broadcast. The order cited multiple violations of ethical standards and interstellar agreements regarding treatment of sentient beings. The suspension wasn't temporary remediation, but indicated potential permanent revocation pending investigation outcomes. The Council's swift action demonstrated how quickly respected institutions could lose official standing when their practices became public knowledge. The Academy's celebrated methods transformed from assets to liabilities overnight. Techniques that had taken centuries to develop and refine were now evidence in potential war crimes proceedings. Graduates who had built careers on psychological manipulation found their professional credentials suddenly questionable. The institution's reputation for excellence became synonymous with ethical failure across diplomatic channels. All graduation ceremonies were canceled indefinitely. The scheduled commencement events would have celebrated the largest graduating class in Academy history. Instead, the amphitheaters remained empty while security teams secured the campus. The cancellation symbolized the complete halt of the institution's core function and the uncertainty surrounding its future existence on 2 centuries of institutional pride, dissolved into diplomatic embarrassment. The Academy's carefully cultivated image of psychological mastery became associated with ethical blindness and operational failure. Their belief in fear as a universal tool had blinded them to the cultural context that made their methods politically unsustainable when exposed to public scrutiny. The situation demonstrated that psychological dominance proved politically fragile when removed from controlled environments. Techniques that worked in interrogation chambers failed spectacularly when subjected to diplomatic examination. The Academy's power had always depended on secrecy and isolation from broader ethical considerations. Meanwhile, Confederation security forces initiated mobilization procedures. Patrol vessels altered courses toward the Academy's coordinates, while ground teams prepared for potential facility seizure. The diplomatic fallout was transitioning into operational response, with implications that extended beyond the institution itself to question numerous Confederation practices. Chaime's demeanor shifted from observer to explainer, his tone carrying the weight of a professional, clarifying basic principles to well-meaning but misguided colleagues. "Humanity doesn't simply resist oppression," he began, his words measured and deliberate. "We study systems of cruelty. We identify patterns of abuse and exploitation. Then we develop countermeasures based on deep psychological understanding." His human transport ship awaited at the landing platform with the same professional detachment he displayed. No visible weapon systems, no aggressive posturing, just efficient design and readiness for departure. The vessel's open hatch revealed a standard interior, configured for scientific research rather than military operations. Monitoring equipment continued recording from within, documenting the security procedures and institutional responses to the exposure. Jaime's manner showed no triumph or gloating over his successful dismantling of their system. He completed his mission with the focused efficiency of a surgeon closing an incision. His quiet professionalism made the Academy's dramatic collapse appear almost self-inflicted, the inevitable result of building on flawed foundations rather than any aggressive action on his part. The institution would never operate the same way again. Their license suspension would likely become permanent revocation. Their methods would be studied as cautionary examples in ethical training rather than emulated as professional standards. Their celebrated techniques would become historical footnotes about psychological manipulations, limitations. 2 centuries of institutional certainty had been dismantled by one calm human who refused to play by their rules. The Academy's confidence in fear as universal tool had blinded them to the possibility that advanced species might develop completely different relationships with terror. Their sophisticated methods were designed for psychological combat against emotional responses, leaving them helpless against clinical observation. The resolution demonstrated that true power lies not in causing suffering, but in understanding complex systems. The ability to break others represents primitive dominance compared to the capacity to prevent harm through comprehension. Technical excellence means little without corresponding ethical development. Jaime's departure marked the beginning of the Academy's transformation from institution of fear to subject of study. Their future would involve ethical re-education rather than technical refinement. Their expertise would be redirected toward healing rather than breaking. Their facilities would serve understanding rather than domination. The security escort to his ship proceeded with formal precision, both sides maintaining professional decorum despite the circumstances. Confederation officials understood they were witnessing not a prisoner release, but a diplomatic transition. The human intervention had exposed systemic problems that required addressing rather than individual actions requiring punishment. His calm exit contrasted with the frantic activity throughout the campus. Faculty members scrambled to secure legal representation. Students questioned their career choices. Administrators calculated the financial implications of license suspension. The entire institution was reeling, while the catalyst for this transformation departed with quiet efficiency. The human ship's engines engaged with a soft hum rather than dramatic roar. The vessel lifted from the platform with smooth precision, its departure as understated as its arrival. There were no triumphant signals, no final messages, just professional completion of the mission, parameters, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Mindbender Academies exposure triggered a galactic recalibration of psychological practices that extended far beyond its crystalline halls. Interrogation techniques across Confederation space suddenly required ethical oversight committees and consent protocols. What was once standard practice became subject to rigorous review by panels representing multiple species perspectives. The shift wasn't gradual, it was immediate and comprehensive, with new guidelines distributed to security forces and diplomatic corps within standard weeks. Multiple member species formally requested human consultation on psychological operations. The Ethereal Council sought advisors to help rewrite their interrogation manuals. The Korans asked for technical assistance in developing ethical monitoring systems. Even the Nightmare Syndicate, despite their earlier fury, quietly inquired about psychological profiling for conflict prevention rather than escalation. Humanity's approach of understanding over breaking gained influential converts across diplomatic channels. The Academy's methods transformed from active practice to historical curiosity. Their sophisticated techniques became case studies in ethical failure, rather than professional standards. Instructors used recordings of the human interrogation to demonstrate how technical excellence could coexist with philosophical blindness. The trophy wall remained, but with new placards explaining the ethical violations each shattered. Consciousness represented former interrogators found themselves retraining as psychological researchers under human guidance. BXR transitioned from fear compound synthesis to anxiety treatment development. Nixwin shifted from telepathic manipulation to therapeutic communication techniques. Guthmos began studying emotional energy transfer for medical applications rather than consumption. Their expertise remained valuable, but now served healing rather than harm. The facility itself underwent symbolic and practical transformation. The examination chambers became demonstration theaters for ethical psychological practices. The trophy hall turned into a memorial space honoring victims of psychological manipulation. Classrooms that once taught breaking techniques now offered courses in conflict resolution and cross-cultural understanding. The architecture remained, but its purpose fundamentally changed. Fear remained understood but ceased being weaponized. Psychological research continued, but with different objectives. Mapping trauma responses for treatment rather than exploitation, studying stress patterns for management rather than induction, analyzing manipulation techniques for prevention rather than application. The knowledge persisted, but its ethical framework completely shifted. The galaxy learned through painful demonstration that understanding consistently outperforms breaking in long-term effectiveness. Techniques designed to cause suffering created diplomatic incidents and ethical failures. Methods focused on comprehension produced sustainable solutions and improved relations. The human approach proved not just morally superior, but practically more effective across multiple applications. This philosophical shift affected numerous Confederation systems beyond interrogation practices. Political control mechanisms faced scrutiny for employing similar psychological principles. Economic manipulation techniques underwent ethical review. Social engineering programs required justification under new standards. The exposure revealed patterns of exploitation that extended far beyond the Academy's operations. Meanwhile, new protocols were being established across Confederation space. Monitoring systems for psychological operations received mandatory upgrades. Ethical review boards gained authority to halt questionable practices. Whistleblower protections expanded to cover psychological manipulation reporting. The changes represented the most significant reform of interstellar psychological practices in 2 centuries. The transition demonstrated that technological sophistication must correspond with ethical maturity. Advanced capabilities require heightened responsibility. The Confederation had developed precise tools for psychological manipulation, while lacking adequate frameworks for their ethical application. Their technical excellence had outpaced their moral development. Humanity's intervention forced necessary but painful growth across multiple institutions. The galaxy's psychological landscape permanently shifted toward understanding as the preferred approach to conflict and difference. The era of systematic breaking gave way to an age of careful comprehension. With all the challenges and opportunities that transformation presented, the Mindbender Academy's legacy became cautionary rather than exemplary, its name synonymous with ethical failure rather than professional excellence. Its story served as a reminder that knowledge without wisdom and power without ethics ultimately prove unsustainable, no matter how technically impressive their implementation might appear initially. Jaime's operation revealed patterns that extended well beyond interrogation chambers and psychological techniques. The principles demonstrated in that examination room applied to numerous other systems of control operating throughout Confederation space. What began as exposure of one institution's methods quickly became illumination of widespread institutional assumptions. Multiple Confederation systems relied on similar psychological foundations as the Academy. Political control mechanisms used refined versions of the same fear-based approaches. Economic manipulation techniques employed comparable principles of psychological pressure. Social engineering programs operated on parallel assumptions about predictable responses to specific stimuli. The Mindbender exposure triggered scrutiny across these interconnected systems. Diplomatic committees began examining political influence techniques that had operated unchallenged for decades. Economic regulators started questioning manipulation methods that exploited psychological vulnerabilities. Social scientists reconsidered engineering, programs that treated sentient beings as predictable systems rather than autonomous individuals. Humanity's analytical approach offered an alternative model that gained surprising traction. Their method of understanding systems rather than exploiting them appealed to species tired of manipulation tactics. The concept of analyzing control mechanisms, rather than simply resisting them, represented a philosophical shift that numerous civilizations found intellectually compelling. The galaxy began reconsidering practices that had seemed standard operating procedure weeks earlier. Techniques that appeared sophisticated in isolation started looking ethically questionable when examined collectively. Methods that worked within specific contexts revealed limitations when applied across diverse species and cultures. This reevaluation extended to basic assumptions about power and control. The Confederation had developed numerous systems based on the idea that sentient psychology followed predictable patterns that could be systematically manipulated. Jaime's demonstration revealed that advanced species often develop countermeasures that make these approaches ineffective or counterproductive. The incident showed how interconnected these systems truly were. Political control relied on economic manipulation, which depended on psychological assumptions that connected back to interrogation techniques. A weakness in one area suggested vulnerabilities throughout the entire structure. The Academy's failure indicated broader systemic issues requiring comprehensive addressing. Humanity's intervention demonstrated that limited actions could trigger widespread change when targeting key pressure points. Their approach focused on understanding system dynamics rather than overwhelming them through force. They identified foundational flaws and applied precise pressure rather than attempting broad confrontation. The resulting scrutiny affected numerous established practices across Confederation operations. Security protocols underwent ethical review. Diplomatic procedures required justification under new standards. Economic policies faced examination for manipulative elements. The changes represented the most significant reconsideration of interstellar relations in generations. This broader implication revealed that the Academy wasn't an isolated exception, but rather typical example of Confederation approaches. Their methods reflected standard assumptions rather than unusual practices. Their exposure therefore suggested needed reforms across multiple systems rather than just one institution. The galaxy's psychological landscape shifted from manipulation to understanding as the preferred framework. Techniques designed to control gave way to methods focused on comprehension. The emphasis moved from predicting responses to appreciating diversity in psychological frameworks across species. One demonstration had triggered widespread reevaluation of practices that had operated for centuries. The encounter revealed that advanced civilizations often outgrow manipulation-based systems, developing resistances that make such approaches increasingly ineffective over time. True sophistication lies in adaptation rather than force. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Mindbender Academies. Two-century doctrine that strength meant breaking others, shattered against humanity's unwillingness to play along. True power, they learned, lies not in inflicting fear but in understanding it. Consider how many systems around us trade on intimidation, coercion, or manufactured dread. Political tactics, workplace cultures, even advertising. Sometimes the most subversive move is not to fight, flee, or concede, but simply to observe, analyze, and refuse the role you've been assigned. Because the greatest force isn't the one that breaks, it's the one that understands why others try.